everybody, wherever you are, and welcome to Conversations with Rudy Rivera. Today we have a very, very interesting topic on it has to do with what's going on in the world. Anybody who's been following the news knows that there's quite a bit going on, not just politically, from a terrorist point of view, from a drug trafficking point of view. And I've often, as active I am with in-house counsel, I notice that companies really don't have a playbook for these kinds of activities that are happening. I was fortunate enough to meet Barbara Llanes in Mexico City, actually Monterrey, where she did on a presentation on, it was basically dealing with terrorist organizations, how you deal with those from a company point of view. And Stphen Ward, who is the CEO of Polaris Risk Management and does all kinds of interesting cyber stuff, but as well as cloak and dagger stuff. So, Barbara, why don't we start with you? Give us like a 30-second bio on you, what you do, and then Steve will go with you, and then we'll shoot off with the discussion.
Sure, and thank you so much, Rudy, for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here discussing these very timely issues. I am an attorney. I've been practicing for too long. And for a period of time, for over 11 years, I was a federal prosecutor with the U.S. Department of Justice, primarily in New Jersey, but I spent several years working at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City for the Department of Justice. And the focus of my work there was money laundering and asset forfeiture. And of course, that involved dealing with the financial component of what cartels were doing and the narco trafficking industry in Mexico. So that gave me a lot of insight into their operations because I worked closely with intelligence agencies and prosecutors and investigators in Mexico City. And now I'm on the private side. I'm a defense attorney. I'm a litigator in Miami, Florida, at a boutique firm here. And our focus is litigation matters in the white collar and commercial space. And as part of that, I advise clients and represent clients in matters involving the Department of Justice and other U.S. and state authorities. And most importantly, we try to also help clients steer away from problems, including, of course, problems involving the cartels. It's a pleasure to be here.
Did you by any chance know Oscar in Mexico City?
Oscar.
His last name was Linnell. I don't want to mention his name because he likes his
Okay. I knew some Oscars. So it depends on what...
he was head of immigration in Mexico City for the Caribbean and Mexico. I
may have known him. I'm not sure.
I think you did, because I think now that I think about it, your name does sound familiar. Stephen, tell us a little bit about Polaris and what you do.
Sure. My name is Stphen Ward. I'm one of the principal founders of Polaris. I have a background of over 30 years in the private security consulting space. I started off with a state and government agency on regulatory and law enforcement aspects when I was young. And from there, I moved into working with law firms and then built an intelligence and investigations company that I exited to Pinkerton, which is one of the largest companies in the world. And I was an executive vice president there. From there, we founded Polaris about 7 years ago, and we have 5 core areas we focus on. One is cybersecurity advisory. Another is investigations. We conduct white-collar investigations. We conduct internal investigations. We deal with defending individuals from the government, in some cases with their client, through the law firms we work with, and then in other cases, intellectual property. The run-of-the-mill investigations that come up during any type of corporate activity, whether it be pre-transactional or transactional. And then we also have an intelligence team. Our intelligence team is a geopolitical team and also a social media and risk-focused team that we work with Fortune 500s to provide them insights to the risks from doing business globally. So dealing in Mexico is an area I've worked in significantly. We're used to dealing with the cartels. We're actually working war zones where we do war zone extractions. We provide armed security domestically and internationally for corporations, individuals, and from there, we've just had a lot of opportunity to deal with our corporate clients that are U.S. multinationals and some of our German multinationals that our Berlin office focuses on, from the doing business in Mexico side, how to learn how to do business with cartels, how to learn how to do business around cartels. And an area where we have a lot of requests is currently what's going on throughout Latin America. And we can talk a little bit about how we counsel our clients. So what you're saying, Rudy, is we see companies deal with what's called a crisis management doctrine, which is typically static, and it's a global doctrine as opposed to broken down to and doesn't have the triggers and mechanisms to deal with as regional aspects change, how they have to address it. I'll pause there.
I agree with you, Steve, and Barbara, chime in on this, because it seems that the process is reactionary. It happens, let's deal with it. I manage litigation, throughout the world, and I've always been a big believer in looking at the politics and seeing what else outside the legal realm is going to affect my case. And so, for example, with the judicial reform in Mexico, I'm following the politics a lot more now. So what type of program do you think that companies should start to not be reactive and just be ahead of the curve? Because it seems to me the most important thing is to have the right professionals on the ground to move at a moment's notice and not scrambling looking for something. Barbara, you're my attorney. Okay, what are you going to advise me?
Well, I mean, look, I think a lot of companies, and Stephen mentioned this, a lot of companies have something in place, right? I mean, companies understand that they have to have some kind of program in place for crisis management, for compliance obligations that they have. So what I think, and I agree with you, Steve, totally, that what I think he's talking about is the need to make it more geographically specific to the needs of the location that that is particularly vulnerable. For example, high risk areas, and there are several places in Latin America where that applies, several countries, and within that several cities, and also for it to be evolving as information comes in and to have a way of capturing that information. So, there's sort of a whole series of steps that companies have to consider in terms of how they're doing ongoing risk assessment and how that risk assessment process adapts to the specific needs of the location, certain locations for companies. But I think the overall theme is that one, which is you have to be able to evolve. You should, of course, companies will have their in-house counsel, but they should have outside counsel available to deal with certain situations that they may not be able to handle internally, or for which they need specialized knowledge or understanding, particularly if they're going to potentially be dealing with U.S. agencies. So overseas companies may have local counsel local outside counsel that advises them on a number of issues that may arise. And that can be even criminal, labor, and other issues. But if a situation arises where they're receiving a subpoena or they're faced with an extortion threat, they may want to also have U.S. counsel on standby to be able to advise them as they deal with that immediate threat.
Steve, what's your comment on that?
So I agree with everything Barbara is saying, and I think that so many times I had a very interesting conversation with the chief security officer of a Fortune 100, and he said big ships turn slowly, meaning large corporations are not fast turning, fast moving. And what we see is a lot of times you're trying to, read the tides per se. In the current administration, one of the things you can say is when they say they're going to do something, they do it. So when we saw the attacks on the purported drug boats in the Pacific and in the Caribbean, and we also saw the policy and plan was at some point to use U.S. Special Forces, CIA, to interdict cartels or interact with them in Mexico. We see this as a big problem that companies should already be looking at. What we do see is that the cartels have now had a significant amount of internal fighting. The Sinaloa, which has always been considered the family organization, is fighting internally. new generation cartel lost its leadership. So now you're going to have a power vacuum. What American companies should be worrying about is the older groups knew how to do business in a way that kept certain businesses running. They always find ways to get into your supply chain to move their product across the border. So companies have to figure out strong to assess their third parties right now, because they're going to become more susceptible, the third parties, the local companies, to extortion, because as the cartels markets get squeezed, they're going to look for other ways. And that's typically squeezing, providers or third parties for companies that are in the automotive space and in the manufacturing space that are moving things by rail into the US. And I think that looking at, where we are right now, the US is kind of focused right now on the Middle East. So there is some breathing room in LATAM. But I think in order to be successful, you can't just have a policy. You have to have people dedicated to that region that understand it. And there's a lot of resources companies, bigger companies know how to use. And I'd say the mid-size to, middle market or a little bit further up ladder are not aware of. And a lot of it is just left on local council saying, hey, we're working with this company, we work with them for years, but no one's ever checked to see if they have narco relationships. No one's ever checked the infrastructure. A lot of times we find that their narco infrastructure is embedded in the local company, and or there's threats of extortion. If you don't help us, we're going to hurt your family. And you need to have those plans, but you also need to articulate that to your organization so that people know how to utilize those services.
It almost seems like you have to think like a criminal.
They say as a good law enforcement agent, it could have been a good criminal, is the theory. You have to be able to think like a criminal to catch a criminal. And you have to think like a thief to be able to protect your goods from a thief.
Well, you have to think like a criminal, and you have to look to see where your vulnerable points are, and you have to look at the cost-benefit analysis with it too. So let's just say, for example, you're a manufacturer of razor blades for shaving, and the terrorist or whoever hijack your truck. That truck says worth $1 million. Okay, so is it cost effective to move the factory to another location, or do you just leave the trucks, being hijacked and figure it's still cheaper, but the cost of doing business, right?
So there's a programmatic approach. So I've worked with a multinational and one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. And when you look at the programmatic approach, is you assess the threat based on the region. So let's say Brazil, which is very well known for cargo theft, you look to get a local policy, segregate that from your insurance for your bigger organization to lower costs. And you're not really going to track down or prosecute the criminals. What you have to do is look at process. What are you doing how are you losing your loads, and how can you mitigate that? In other words, how do you move them? Is it nighttime, daytime? Are you using escorts? What are the ways to create barriers for this same loss not to happen again and again? And then also to utilize your council and your local council to leverage what they can through local law enforcement and governmental connections in the U.S. consul. And, there's a lot of resources that can be brought to bear as opposed to a siloed approach.
And Barbara, what type of team do you think a company should have in place?
Well, look, I think sort of what Stphen is talking about is correct. You want to make sure that you maximize the resources at your disposal, and you should have a sense of what those resources are in advance. Your local team and your outside team and whoever their contacts are. You have to have an understanding that if you're gonna do the insurance route, and you're gonna try to get insurance to cover these issues, that you have to be able to demonstrate that you're going to also adapt, and this isn't going to be a recurring issue. Your team has to be strategic. Now companies are starting to use artificial intelligence to help identify, okay, these are areas of risk. These are, based on, police reports, based on patterns that are being identified. These are ways that we can avoid these types of, run-ins with criminals. It's interesting. When we were in Monterey, I was speaking to someone who mentioned that it has happened to some clients that they sort of know they're going to have certain loads or items stolen. And they accept that that's going to be something that they're just not going to be able to get away from. And it's almost like fighting it will make it worse for them and for their employees, for the company that is, and for their employees. So they let it go. And I think, my concern with that approach is that if there is a pattern of theft, monthly pattern, or, from time to time, that one, you're going to have problems with insurance, but two, if you get U.S. law enforcement authorities looking at it, they may recognize that it's basically almost like a payment that is being made to the criminals because you're
Exactly.
just letting it go. So one of the things that I think is critical is to have a team in place that's going to be documenting the steps that you're taking and demonstrating that they're not just superficial steps to try to comply with the basics, but they're really that you're really making an effort to avoid these issues. And to your original question, are you going to potentially have to move the location, of your factory, or something more drastic, leave the area altogether? I think all of those things have to be considered and evaluated. It's, it obviously depends on the specifics and the context, but everything has to be on the table and assessed, and having the right people to do that, is conduct that assessment, is important.
I agree with you 100% because it makes it look to, say, a regulator coming in that that's just really an indirect way of paying a bribe, and you're letting it go. You know what's happening. I equate this also to the FCPA, that basically, it's more, you got to have more than just a piece of paper or a handbook that says don't bribe anybody. You have to have procedures in place. And to me, it seems some of those procedures would have to be doing dry runs, having constant training, and primarily, I think, looking for your weak areas. As litigators, Barbara, you and I know that when we're managing a case, we look at our strong point, we look at our weak point. If we win, we generally know why. If we lose, we'll generally know why, although sometimes we get surprised, right? You never know what goes on in a courtroom sometimes, but I think for the most part is spotting those things early on is a process that I think people should follow, especially when you're in high-risk areas.
Right. And something that I think is relevant is the identification component. Like Stphen was saying, there may be vendors that you're dealing with, or suppliers that you're dealing with for years that you don't recognize have an affiliation or are controlled by an organization that potentially is a foreign terrorist or has been designated as a foreign terrorist organization. And you want to figure out how to identify that. And there's sort of a checklist that, you can go through to do that. I mean, of course, you can figure out, you have to see, okay, if this is a company that I'm dealing with, how long has this company been around? Who is behind this company? Does this company really have employees? I mean, does it exist as a real company? And if you identify ownership or associations, and you also want to check, okay, are these individuals that appear on certain sanctions or terrorist lists? Try to access just even public reports that identify information about the company or the individual. Look at addresses. Where is this company supposedly operating? Is it really a business location, or is this a structure doesn't even exist? Review internal knowledge from even within your company. There may be individuals who have more information about that area or territory. So I think there's a number of things that a company needs to do to understand who they are dealing with, who their vendors are, who the third parties are that are providing services for them, and what are the associations and affiliations and controllers of those entities. And one thing that, sort of segueing off of that for a second, that I just want to make clear is, because we haven't set out the framework, I think, from the US perspective for why all of this matters so much now. And the reason it matters is because after the Trump organization, the Trump administration took over last year in 2025, one of the first things that they did was designate certain cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. And that has a lot of implications. We can get to that. I'm not going to talk about all of that now. But that's why all of this matters, because if as a company you're dealing with what has been designated as a foreign terrorist organization, there are some serious implications for you and some serious liability that you can be confronting as a company and as an executive of a company or even as an employee of a company.
Steve, do you think there's more active U.S. involvement in that area? Because I remember that, for example, FinCEN just recently declared 3 financial institutions in Mexico, Cibanco, Intercam, and I think Veplin, as basically money launderers for the drug cartel. And that just, I think, pretty much shut them all down then and there.
So unpacking a lot here, what Barbara leaned into is something that we see often is complacency. The idea that we're going to accept a certain amount of loss. And I don't care what organization, and if you start going off by saying, I'm going to accept this amount of loss, every year that's going to go up because it just becomes a path of least resistance. Using AI is unique in certain ways. I've been a long proponent, before AI was even really popular, of taking large-scale programs or mid-sized programs, looking at your losses on a global level, and you use AI, it can tell you where to dedicate your dollars, where you're losing your money, where you're losing your load, and where the highest risk is. Knowing your clients or your vendors per se, I see a lot of US-centric organizations that are global that don't even understand the differentials. Mexico, you can't run a criminal search on an individual. Now, the individual can run a search on themselves and they can go collect that data. What we have done in the past is escorted them to the actual police station where the search is done. And when they get handed it, we get it. That doesn't mean it's not going to be tainted if they are linked, but a lot of the information is available. We have found time and time again, when we've been brought in to look at vendors, when you go downstream, there can be a part owner of a company that could be linked to a narco. These things can be identified. The complacency in the US right now is that this organization and this administration is not pursuing white collar. Well, that may not be the situation right now. They are pursuing white collar when it comes to anti-money laundering for narco trafficking. They are heavily invested in disrupting cartels. So these are the things that people should be looking at. The other aspect is, again, looking at the entire program of what it could hit for the C-suite. I think that's when the rubber hits the road. When Barbara or someone like Barbara comes in and says, some of this is compliance that you're doing with the cartel could negatively affect the C-suite, board members then want to see a change. They want to see protocols. And the key is to have communication between the different departments. A lot of times, corporate security acts in its own, corporate risk acts within its own, and general counsel is brought in when everyone's afraid, like, oh no, we have to have top cover. There needs to be a little bit more understanding that you can utilize the legal arm to help you achieve your goals in all of the other areas with risk and security services. And that's where we're successful, utilizing local resources. We have vetted resources. We certainly don't go into Mexico ourselves and try to do this. We have local partners that have been vetted we work with for years that understand the laws, the customs, and a lot of times that information can then counsel our clients on things that they've been doing wrong or against the law locally that they just never took the time to learn.
So far, I think our discussion has been on external forces that go into the country, but a lot of the corruption or these problems come in from internal people who are cooperating. There was a company in San Luis Potosí, Mexico, for example, who signed a multi-million-dollar contract with the vendor just to extort money from the company. So you have to have the processes for your internal employees because they can be bought, they can be intimidated, I mean, one of the reasons why the terrorist organizations, the cartels, are so very powerful is because they provide financial incentives for people that they don't get. So when you look at a police officer that makes $200 a month and a cartel comes and say, we'll give you $500 a month.
Right.
It's pretty tempting, you know? And so I think you need to have programs internally that prevent that from happening.
I would agree. I've done a number of investigations with foreign entities where they have a country manager that no one has done an updated investigation or no one looked at it. Next thing you know, that country manager has multiple organizations linked to them. In a lot of cases we've seen in Brazil where you can't have a foreign national company own a majority. You have to have a Brazilian partner that owns it. So a lot of times when you're in Brazil, you'll see that it'll become a joint venture. A lot of times that we've gone in, we've seen that the principals of the joint venture have a similar company already set up and they're diverting business, which is a whole nother aspect. So there's a very, I'd say not a hesitance, but not a urgency to do quarterly or yearly updated investigations of their key people within these countries, because that's where graft happens. That's where the cartel comes in and says, look, you know, we're going to move this amount through your shipments. You're just going to sign off and you're going to get this amount of money. No one will ever know. It's easy. Your company never checks. When they check is when it's already too late, when something has gone completely wrong. And people like Barbara and compliance are saying, hey, we've got notice from the US government that they're intercepting shipments. Where this can become very costly is automakers. So automakers still move their vehicles by rail out of Mexico. Those trains move very slow. Cartels use them consistently to put drugs in. Now, what most people don't realize that if an automaker has their vehicles seized by customs, the DEA, or law enforcement because they found drugs in them, they don't get those vehicles back. And we all know that the supply chain has been very slow to get vehicles. Those vehicles are, for the life cycle of the case, now in the custody of the U.S. government. So those vehicles have already been paid for, identified, could be a very expensive car, and now it's sitting in a U.S. government compound because someone looked the other way or no one assessed what the danger is. And, you know, I know one motor maker where you make work with that they take their super high-end vehicles and move them separately because they don't want them seized, because those cars are hard to make. They cost a lot of money. And when they're pre-ordered, they don't want them to be seized by the government or caught up in a seizure because drugs have been stored in them. I'll pause there.
Yeah, Barbara, there was a company, a trucking company in Texas that they were building false bottoms to transport drugs. It was a big deal.
Well, you know, jumping off of the point with the vehicles and in general with forfeiture, forfeiture can happen in a criminal case. There's different ways that assets like vehicles can be seized or in the long term or in the longer term forfeited. And that can happen first administratively, like an agency can identify an asset that either was obtained through unlawful, it's proceeds of unlawful activity, or it was an instrument of the misconduct, and so they can seize it administratively, and the owner of the property may be provided notice, and they can try to challenge it, and there's a process for that. But administrative seizures happen all the time, and you know, a lot of times the agencies will just keep them. Certainly, if there were vehicles with traps underneath them, those would be instrumentalities of unlawful conduct, and so there would be a pretty good argument there on behalf of the authorities for seizing and then ultimately forfeiting those vehicles. On the forfeiture, side, or the seizure side, where you're not talking about administrative seizure, you can have seizures through warrants that are obtained by prosecutors. And those seizures may exist for a certain period of time, and then eventually there could be an action, either a criminal action that leads to criminal forfeiture, or a civil forfeiture where the burden is much lower. The authorities would just have to prove, they don't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. They have to prove that it's more likely than not that the asset was used in furtherance of a crime, or that it's proceeds of a crime. So that's one of the biggest risks that, companies and individuals would have in terms of their assets, is that they could be seized if they are found to be involved in the unlawful conduct. So that's something that's very important to take into account as well. I mean, I have clients who have gotten their crypto seized, not because the clients knowingly were involved in misconduct, but because unknowingly, or because of sort of some lack of understanding about the requirements for due diligence, some of the vendors and clients that they were dealing with were involved in money laundering, and some of the flows of that money affected the clients' wallets. So it's important to really understand the asset seizure and asset forfeiture components that create additional exposure for companies.
It's also important to note that if it takes a while to get your property back in the U.S. with these proceedings, how much longer it would take to get the property back in a foreign country, especially a third world country. You may never get it back.
Yeah, and dovetailing on what Barbara said is, not on the multinational side, but when you're dealing with the middle market, maybe the $50, $100 million company, I have clients come to me and say, hey, well, we're doing this internal investigation. They're like, oh, we got a subpoena from the FBI. They just want to look at some stuff. What do you think? I'm like, why are you talking to me? Talk to a lawyer. I was like, they're the vampire. Do not let them into your house. I'm like, they're not just coming altruistically. You may not be doing anything illegal, but someone within your organization, some third party may be doing something. I was like, and I see that a lot of that. It's like, oh, it's a government. We've done nothing wrong. Let them in. And I'm like, oh, get a lawyer. Talk to your lawyer, very quickly, because like what Barbara's saying is, it may not be something you did. It may not be something but it may be a due diligence that you didn't undertake. It may be someone within your organization that's in a position of equity, or maybe even a power or fiduciary role, that has undertaken something that could negatively impact the business and the other parties. And you'd be surprised from my perspective of how many people are just like, oh, it's the US government. I've done nothing wrong. I'm just going to let them, see what they want to see. Even on a computer forensic case, we say we'll image it and we'll provide them the device. We don't want to, and we'll give them what they want to look at, but we're not going to give them access to come into your office and then start looking through it and saying, we want this device, this device, this device. There needs to be some protections put in place for the business owner so that they can protect themselves from themselves in many cases.
Sure, you should always negotiate with the when you serve the subpoena, that's always negotiable.
Right.
What they want. And, because sometimes when you call them, Barbara, if you have this experience, you call the FBI or whoever issuing the subpoena and say, what is it you really want?
Right.
Subpoenas tend to be very broad. Go ahead, Barbara, you were going to say something to add to Steve's comment.
Well, I just it's very common if you're running a legitimate business, which, most companies are, and you are subpoenaed or, asked to be interviewed by the authorities, you're thinking, okay, well, that's fine for that reason. I mean, that is the most common response, is I have nothing to worry about. I've even had clients just call the FBI and say, hey, let's, what do you want to know? And I'm like, no, why? Why did you do that? Because, people have, when they get arrested, everyone knows the Miranda rights, right? Everyone knows you have a right to remain silent. Everything you can say everything you say can and will be held against you. The same applies to companies. And they may not think they've done anything, but they don't know what kind of exposure they're walking themselves into. So that is one of the reasons why you definitely need to have counsel on standby to make a phone call to someone who is a trusted advisor before you go in and talk to the authorities or turn things over. And like you said, Rudy, there's a lot of negotiation that happens with law enforcement when they're issuing subpoenas, in terms of deadline, in terms of scope. And if those things can't be worked out and what they're seeking is unreasonable, there may be avenues for challenging the scope of the request. So there are a lot of tools that, can and should be used to potentially explore different ways of responding to a subpoena. And so I think, once again, it's just important to have counsel advise on these decisions and before taking these steps.
Most people don't realize when you're talking to a federal agent, the federal agents have a statute in which they can enact at any time that if you say something that's untruthful, now that doesn't mean you're trying to deceive them. You may make a statement to say, I have never seen anything like that in my company, and later they find it. That's a 2-year minimum sentence. FBI uses that quite often when they're trying to bring people to the table to negotiate. So we tell our clients is, don't go to your real estate lawyer. Make sure your real estate lawyer or your general counsel contact someone that understands, federal procedures when it comes to criminal work and defense, and make sure that you just have a conversation. Look, if you have nothing to hide and you're good, then you can just have your counsel sit there to guide you and answer the questions that they ask. A lot of times people, like Barbara said, is, I've done nothing wrong. So then they just start volunteering things, and they don't realize that they may be a small part of a bigger investigation that they may need. And I think that's what happens when you go overseas. We see people not really understand the laws in which they may be acting and how it could negatively impact them at a later time.
See, what I would do is when I get the subpoena, I'd go to the unit that has that information and say, why does the FBI want this information? What do we have? Okay. In the meantime, I would call the FBI and say, okay, I want to know what you really want, because I want to try to get it for you. And we do want to cooperate. So you lay that groundwork. We want to cooperate. We're going to hide anything, but we got to know what we're facing. Okay. And most of the time, I think they'll relax. And if you put them like you're in a cooperation mode, which you are, and I think it makes it a lot easier. But I agree. We just open the door and say carte blanche, And Stephen, to your point, I was a criminal defense lawyer in a prior life, and lying to a law enforcement has always been the extra counts. And if you look at a very famous person here who was charged with insider trading, I think you know who I'm talking about. She was acquitted on that, but convicted of lying to law enforcement officials. The last federal case I tried was a dredging environmental protection case where some EPA calls and says, hey, are you dumping the mud back in the Missouri River? No, count 3. Somebody else calls, are you dumping the mud back in the river? No, count 4. So 3 counts of lying to law enforcement officials. That's a very, very common ploy. So that's why it's important never to make a statement.
Well, if law enforcement sees that you're willing to cooperate, and you handle it properly, a lot of times you can gain information. I had an organization where the agent knew me. He contacted me, knew we somehow got our report. We didn't know how. The client forwarded it. They were doing an investigation. They contacted us. We said, we can't talk to you. Everything we have is protected by attorney work product privilege. You need to talk to the client. Later downstream, we found out that once the client properly addressed the government agencies, they were able to shed light on an internal problem that company had. They were investigating. The company then helped facilitate the investigation, which led to an arrest and a prosecution, and the company was exonerated of knowingly doing anything, and they were in the press release as being a partner to the government, which is what you want to see, because when you're operating overseas, there's always something can happen. I've gotten calls where, hey, I have a container shipment that's supposed to be baby powder is full of cocaine in Uruguay. What do we do? And you got to look at the PR aspect, and you have to look at all these different aspects, because we see social media can change on people so quickly. From a business optic, you have to make sure that every team is in line with your plans, and that goes back to the idea of having focused, not a static global crisis response, having a regionalized and something that can be updated based on current events, because things move quick.
Barbara, when you were a prosecutor, my experience has been that they'll tell you if you're a target or not. A lot of times. Well, they'll say, we're just looking for this information, in my experience. Don't always believe that, okay? That's one of the first questions I would ask is, are we a target? I'd like to know.
Well, in fact, I mean, that is one of the basic questions that an attorney would ask a prosecutor who has issued a subpoena or is trying to interview people is, okay, well, what's the status of my client? Is my client just, are you seeking these things because my client has relevant information, or, have you identified my client as someone who has already engaged in misconduct, and you've sort of believe that there's enough evidence that my client has conducted misconduct or engaged in misconduct, and now you're just trying to get more evidence against my client? Or is my client sort of, there's an in-between category that, isn't quite an official category, but it's a subject. In other words, the company or the individual may be someone of interest to the prosecutors, but they haven't quite figured out where they stand. And I think that's obviously the most, one of the more precarious ones. Ideally, the client is not a subject or a target that has been identified as engaging in wrongdoing. I want to talk to a second point, which is potentially, going to the government and saying we've identified a problem internally, we've identified misconduct internally, and we are going to disclose it to you. We're going to disclose that misconduct, and we're going to cooperate, and we want to remediate, because that is one of the considerations that is important for counsel to be involved with. If a company figures out that they've had employees, and they could be, or executives involved in misconduct, one of the critical things is first understanding the scope of that misconduct. And that's part of what you do when you conduct an internal investigation, is really trying to understand what happened, who was involved, what the extent of it is. And then once you've realized that, then engaging in immediately, as soon as possible, remediation, trying to fix the problem, and figure out ways to pay back for, if there's any losses, pay back for those losses. So if you're going to approach the government, that's called, self-disclosure. And if you're going to engage, certainly with the Department of Justice, if you're going to engage in self-disclosure, then you want to be in a posture where you can say, we've identified the problem, we've done this investigation, we've begun remediation, we are prepared to, pay any associated fees, and we're here to cooperate and make things better and work with you. So, but that is a very difficult decision to make, whether you are going to do self-disclosure.
You don't always get a break if you
You don't always get the break. I mean, with the current administration, they've indicated that if you engage in self-disclosure, there's a high chance you will not be prosecuted, but it's never a guarantee, and you could still be prosecuted. So absolutely, that's why it's a very difficult decision to make. It involves taking into account a number of factors before making that decision. But it is one of the potential options that should be considered by a company facing, misconduct from within.
Well, you should also, I think, include to what you said is what remedial action you've taken.
Of course.
That you've taken swift action to make sure it doesn't happen again. Because I think it's a big mistake to go and say, oh, we found this out, but okay, what do we do?
Exactly.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I would say the investigation is key to that. If your investigation can identify that an individual in a position, are they able to shield or hide this from the company, it gives the company a much stronger case to say, well, we uncovered this. We found that these individuals were actively doing certain aspects to obfuscate or hide the misconduct from us. And the only way we could do this is by conducting an internal investigation. If it's something blatant, where you're violating FCPA laws, where people are giving gifts to certain people in governments or quasi-municipalities, or other types of aspects that should have been picked up through normal auditing processes, then I think you have a much harder road to go to sell the government you didn't know about it. But I also think that that's all identified in the internal investigation and how you handle that. And, we have a lot of clients who'll come to us specifically with supply chain losses, and they'll say, look, how do we get the government involved? In some cases, the goods that are being taken could be linked to weapons of mass destruction. They can be linked to biohazards, things like that. It's how you do the investigations, how you identify the products that have been stolen, and then you can bring that, and the government will bring their weight to bear. We've had cases where they've come back and said, this is a great report, we're going to take over the case. We'd like you to cease any operations you're doing, because these products, car batteries can be used to be an accelerant in an IED or a large-scale explosive device. We had a client that was losing a significant amount of them, and it wasn't an easy fraud to stop. But when the government got involved, they identified key players over time, and they were able to not only stop it, but prosecute, and then again, give the client credit for bringing it to the government's attention.
We have a question here, since this is, the title of this is OMG, What's Happening in Mexico. The question is, are Mexican authorities also a risk factor to be considered because of the level of corruption that can be found at the levels of the government?
100%. I mean, you have to do that, and that's where your resources that are local, your trusted partners in Mexico, will tell you that this person has a reputation of this person has a reputation of that, this person has a reputation as a hardline prosecutor or is very, very in line with law enforcement. But that's where that local understanding comes into play, as opposed to saying, okay, well, let me fly down there and talk to my local people there. You need to have local resources, local law firms, local intelligence and investigative firms.
I will also note that, on the DOJ side, just when I was in Mexico, it depended, like you said, Stephen, on specifically who you're dealing with and what unit you're dealing with. If you're at the federal prosecutor's office, the state level, police, there's a number of factors to be taken into account, and that's why local counsel is very important, because they'll know these folks. But also, if you've uncovered misconduct and it's in Mexico and you want to reach a global resolution, in other words, you want to resolve any potential liability, criminal or civil, that may exist in the US with US authorities and in Mexico with Mexican authorities. You want to have counsel from both countries involved so that they can decide what makes sense in terms of the best course of action. It may be that they decide together that it makes sense to go to DOJ first and then have DOJ involve the Mexican authorities. And that's something that's very common. Or you may want to do simultaneous sort of conversations, but try to get everyone together. Those are steps that have to be coordinated and they have to be thoughtfully considered before you take action. So yes, those risk factors exist in Mexico, and that's why it's important to have a process for addressing misconduct in Mexico.
And even in law enforcement, so typically in the military, the Mexican Marines are notoriously clean. They are the ones that go after the narco terrorists. You also have the federal police, but there is some integration there with the cartels, and it changes. When we look at kidnap and ransom assessments, when our high net worth clients are traveling, our executives, they say, well, who do we call? It may be the National Guard, because in certain areas outside of Mexico City, the National Guard is not corruptible in certain areas, certain commands, and they're the fastest to respond. But again, when you look at that, when we were looking at, there's a community outside of Mexico City that's turned into more of a touristy for medical procedures. It's very safe. It looks like you're in, Bel Air type situation. But when we looked at it from an assessment point, there was road construction. So how quick could we get resources there if we needed it from law enforcement, and which agency is the least corrupt out of all? But in general, Mexico is somewhat of a, at all levels of government, cartels have some level of control. It's just the way it is.
Well, I think with the judicial reform, the government is now more one unit, okay? Because prior to the judicial reform, President AMLO was upset that the court ruled against several of his initiatives and said, well, I'll fix you. We'll get the majority in Congress. And now all the judges are elected and subject to political influence. Now, for example, if a company has a case in Mexico pending where they're being sued, you now have to do a lot of due diligence on the judge.
Right.
Is the judge, part of that organization? Is the judge still part of the old guard? Because now they're all elected, people with no experience. Barbara, one question I have for you is that it seems that everything is siloed. There's crisis management, there's threat of physical violence. That should all be really one unit handling all of them, right? Because criminals don't necessarily separate the categories, right?
Well, they should certainly be working together. You can have you can have, and if you're talking about internally whether you're talking internally or
Internally,
externally.
physical security, cyber threats, and insider vulnerability, political risk, they're all treated as separate units.
Right. And look, they have different operations. They have different things that they need to be doing, but they should be communicating. And if you have a situation that arises, those different components, like I said, internally or externally, I mean, it depends on the situation, obviously. If it's sort of an immediate threat situation where if you're facing an extortion threat where there is a danger of physical harm, then you have to take into account all of those components, the legal, the security, and of course the media and PR components of it. So you're going to want a team that is collaborative, working together. At the same time, these people, of course, are going to have their own structures that need to be operating just at all times, evolving, developing the different mechanisms that they're going to use to address your needs when the risk or the situation arises.
And we're winding up now. I know, Steve, you have a hard call.
Yep.
But the question I have for both of you is, why is the first 48 hours so important?
I give you from the investigative in our side is within the first 48 hours, we can assess a significant amount of data. We can obtain information that can guide the investigation as to where you're going to go, what data is available, and is the threat real? If someone's kidnapped, is it a express kidnapping where they're looking for a short-term quick payoff, or was this someone was taken and they're looking for greater goods, or in some cases, Sinaloa has been threatening U.S. tourists with outward harm and violence, and that changes the dynamic of how we approach it. And I'll pause there.
The first 48 hours are when mistakes can be made, and those mistakes can be extremely costly down the road. And because, if it's a critical situation, adrenaline is running high, and there are people who will, become very nervous and make decisions out of emotion and not because they're prepared and because they're being rational. And that is why if you have a team in place who is adept at dealing with a crisis situation, you can reduce the possibility of making a major mistake within the first 48 hours. I mean, the steps that Stephen outlined are sort of the steps you're going to take, right? You're going to assess the situation. You're going to figure out what the steps are that need to be taken. And if there's a real potential for significant harm, obviously those missteps could be very significant. They could lead to loss of life. They could lead to they could lead to criminal exposure. All kinds of things can happen if there are missteps. And so that is why
you need somebody who's objective also.
Of course.
Who's objective is going to be able to give you an honest opinion, an opinion detached from any emotion that's involved. That's what
We've seen it with threats of violence against individuals, and some people dismiss them. And one person said to me, "How do you rate them?" We have a doctor of forensic psychology who will look at the threat, but on a large scale, I've seen people make threats, and then all of a sudden you see that they're traveling to, how close are they to your geographic area? Oh, wow, now they've left Florida and they've shown up in New York City. That's a higher level threat. That first 48 hours, you have to assess whether or not, everything you can gather and what you can determine from that, and that should guide your course of action in your team. But I think it was a great conversation, Rudy. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you. And so the moral of the story is, Barbara and Stephen work together.
Yes.
Because, somebody needs to handle internally the legal part of it. And Stephen, you're the boots on the ground pretty much.
Yeah. Lawyers are the ones that guide us. We have lawyers that work with us, but at the end of the day, we work with lawyers and defer to them. And if the investigative side is not realizing that, then they're not the proper investigator. Every investigator should look to their legal counsel to help them build their case one way or the other and provide them the support to do that. They shouldn't be just doing what they think because they were whatever agency and have so many years of experience. At the end of the day, we answer to someone, and our work has to be done in a way that it can be usable by the legal teams.
Well, go ahead, Barbara. Go ahead.
I was just going to say the teamwork and confidence in the people who are part of your team are critical. And those things develop with experience And so when you have a team in place that knows how to operate together, that is trustworthy, that trusts each other, that have confidence in each other's capabilities, you're much more likely to have success.
Yep.
And the subject of another conversation when you talk about hiring the professionals in a country is making sure they're not corrupt, making sure they're not in on the take, and that you're getting really good advice. But that's the subject of a whole nother discussion.
Barbara, it was a pleasure meeting you.
Take care,
Likewise,
everybody.
Stephen.
Thank
Rudy,
you so
thank you
much,
for having us.
everybody. Tune in. Stphen Ward with Polaris and Barbara Llanes, practicing attorney in Miami, partner with Gelber, Schachter, and Greenberg. Thank you so much, everybody.
All right. Have a great day.
Thank you.